introduce Adriano Pedrosa, who is a curator from Brazil. He will be organizing a program of residencies and talks, followed by an exhibition to open on the 9th of November on the occasion of 25 years, our 25th anniversary. Adriano will give us an insight into this curatorial work today. The talk will be in English. And just before you start, Ahmed will give this introduction in Arabic for the people who didn't know.
نفس الانترودكشن. مرحبا، ادريانو بيدروسا ناظم معارض من البرازيل، اللي هو راح يكون مسؤول عن تنظيم برنامج الإقامات الفنية واللقاءات اللي راح تؤدي للمعرض الاحتفالي بذكرى 25 سنة لتأسيس دارات الفنون 9 نوفمبر تشرين الثاني. وهلا راح يلقي لنا شوي نظرة مقربة على عمله كمنصة معرض.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Can you hear me? Well, the idea today for me as a guest curator here of these programs of exhibition, talks and residencies that we're putting together for the fall, opening on November 9th. The idea for me today was to try to share with you a little bit of my experience, about my history and my practice, and basically to tell you a little bit where I'm coming from, so you know a bit of my history. I am a curator based in Sao Paulo, originally from Rio de Janeiro. I studied law and economics as an undergraduate, and then went on to study fine arts, taking MFA, actually a Master in Fine Arts at the California Institute of the Arts in Valencia. Later worked a little bit in the program of comparative literature at the UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles. After that, I was invited, I was actually a practicing artist back then. That's the sort of most of the 90s and early 2000s. So my curatorial practice is very much coming from an artistic practice as well, and it's very much informed by that. After that, after the PhD in comparative literature, I was invited to work as a curator at the Biennale of Sao Paulo in 97, 98. And after working in Sao Paulo and in subsequent curatorial projects, the curatorial work became very important in my practice and almost sort of overshadowing the artistic practice, which I then decided to leave aside and concentrate in my work as a curator and as a writer as well. This presentation today is sort of a larger presentation, and the way I've organized it is around a library of publications, biblioteca in Portuguese, a library of publications that I have worked in related to exhibition projects or related to programs in museums and related to published writing as well. What I did bring, this is a sort of a longer presentation. I will skip through some of the projects, but what you have there as a printed text is an example of a text that I quite like, which is the International Curator in the Ibero-American Artist, a short story by Adriano Pedrosa published in Greece in 97. So later you can read it. What it is basically reflecting my interest in bringing in the creative and blending it somehow with the critical. So the short story becomes a model for you to sort of talk about art and curatorial practice and exhibitions in general. You can look at that later on. This is actually the pages of Freeze magazine in 97, where the short story was first published. Back then, as I mentioned, I was still a practicing artist. And I would also copy the text on paper and compose these drawings very much related to the published text. So this was my work as an artist somehow blending the critical, the creative, and the artistic. And this is the library in March 2013 of different publications that I've done. And through the presentation today, they're organized in chronological order. Through this presentation, we will look individually at some of the publications, some of them more quickly, but at least I mentioned a little bit my history in curatorial practice, editorial practice, and my investments and particular focus in publications as well. The publications, after all, is what remains from the exhibition. So after the exhibition, 10, 15, 20 years after the exhibition, the memory of it is somehow fragmented and dispersed, and what remains is the other publications. These are the first publications that I'm bringing here today, related to the 24th Biennale São Paulo. I was an adjunct curator of that biennial, as well as the editor of the publications. We did 4 volumes of the publications. Here you have, from left to right, the 4 segments of the exhibition. This is considered, in fact, 98 São Paulo Biennial is considered a sort of a historical edition of the biennial. I was working with Chief Curator Paul Heckenhoff, and the center, the conceptual center of the exhibition was around the notion of Anthropophagia, which is a very important concept for Brazilian modernism. You can see there, it gives the title of the second volume there, which is the historical nucleus, Anthropophagia, and history of cannibalism. Anthropophagia, a very complex concept. I'll try to explain it rather briefly. The Brazilian modernist intellectual, Oswaldo de Andrade, would somehow bring in the notion of symbolic cannibalism, where one indigenous would eat the flesh of another being in order to incorporate and appropriate not just the meat and the flesh itself, but the symbolic and cultural values of that other individual. So anthropophagia, cannibalism somehow, because it becomes an interesting post-colonial concept, perhaps you could consider it, before post-colonialism came about, but it becomes a model for the intellectual at the margins of Europe to relate to the European, overwhelming European references. The intellectual at the margins, in this case in Brazil, would thus be able to appropriate European references, European culture, European history, appropriating, digesting it rather in a cannibalistic fashion, and then later producing something of his own, something singular, hybrid, mestizo, as we call it in Latin America, of his own. The 4 volumes then of the 24th Biennale São Paulo that you see here, each one pertains to a different segment of the exhibition. From left to right, we have national representations, where each country would bring a representative of that country to the exhibition. The second volume is precisely the historical nucleus around anthropophagia and histories of cannibalism. The second volume is Routes, which was an exhibition of contemporary art co-curated by 12 curators in different parts of the world. And the 4th volume was dedicated to Brazilian contemporary art. We have here one installation shot of the exhibition, of the Brazilian contemporary art exhibition. From left to right, you see the works of Brazilian artists, Rosângela Renaud, Leo. Do I have a pointer? Yeah. Please let me know if you have questions, or often I'm very familiar, of course, with the project, and I might sort of, something might need clarification, so please feel free to interrupt me. This is the work of Rosângela Renaud over here, Leo Nilsson, another Rosângela Renaud, an Ernesto Neto photograph, Miguel Rio Branco, Sandra Cinto, and the Book of Meat, made of actual meat by Tupá, a Portuguese-Brazilian artist. The next project, I'll just mention it briefly, made in 2000, was originally a printmaking exhibition in Curitiba in the south of Brazil, which we somehow unfolded into an exhibition called Marks of the Body, Folds of the Soul, again co-curated with Paulo Eckenhoff, with whom I had worked in the São Paulo Biennial 2 years before. What's interesting for me in the exhibition and this idea of the mark of the body and somehow of the time patina, that somehow the paper and the print gets imprinted over time. That's why I showed 2 copies of the brand new book and the book already aged as if it had also received these marks of the body that we're talking about here in the exhibition. So somehow the graphic project related to the concept of the exhibition itself. Another important exhibition for me, made also in 2000, is Fricciones. Fricciones is an exhibition of Latin American arts, one of 5 exhibitions made by the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid. I co-curated that exhibition with Ivo Mesquita. One key issue of the exhibition was precisely the notion of mestizaje, or the blending of different cultures and ethnicities and races. Of course, Latin America it's a key concept in Latin American cultural history, and particularly in Brazil, very much so as well. And mestizaje relates to the mixing of the African race, the indigenous races, several different indigenous races, and the European races, either Portuguese, Spanish, or other. So this is what you see here. It's a colonial painting where you have one individual from one race, the casta painting. This is an example of the casta painting. The mother and the resulting child on the back cover of the publication. This is a short concept of the of exhibition Fricciones, which basically was bringing in, maybe it's worth reading it a little bit. Fricciones articulates the notion of Jorge Luis Borges' fiction with that of friction, with the intention of constructing a complex and incomplete panorama of Latin American art. So there was this idea of offering a panorama of Latin American art centered in contemporary 20th century art, but always this idea of an incomplete panorama. No, not that we could offer a complete, perfect panorama and representation of that of art in Latin America. So here are a few pages of the book. It was important at that time to bring in not just visual art, but literary and theoretical and historical fragments. So the book did always this juxtaposition. Again, you have a work of Leo Nilsson on the right and a fragment, which I cannot read which one it is, but there were several throughout the book. As you can see here, this is another example. It also draws this is an allegory of the Americas, 17th century silver piece. And this was a few images of one of the of a picture gallery, as we called it, where you have an Argentine senora, from the 19th century, ethnographic depiction of a Mexican Siqueiros painting. Again, 2 sort of colonial figures, a Chilean portrait, a Brazilian mestizo, and a Bolivian indigenous portrait. This was in 2000. The next project I'm talking about is Museo de Arte da Pampulha. I was curator of exhibition and programs there. And this is the image of the museum, a former casino, in fact, in Belo Horizonte, in Brazil, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, the famous Brazilian modernist architect in the 30s. So this is a young Oscar Niemeyer building at his early stage. Originally designed to be a casino, but then in the 1950s, gambling became illegal in Brazil, was outlawed, and the casino was then transformed into a museum. We have very limited funds. This is a museum belonging to the municipality of Belo Horizonte in Brazil. I was working there between 2002 and 2005. In terms of publications, what we did in fact were mostly postcards and exhibition brochures and folders. These are some of the images of the exhibition announcements. We will always go back to old pictures of the casino. Here are some more of them. To use them as exhibition announcements, and the artists would always choose a particular image that they felt related to. Being a very small museum with limited funds, it was important for us to bring that somehow the handmade, homemade quality to the publications as well. So much of the publication, some text of the publication was actually stamped, as you can see, hand stamped, which gave this handmade, intimate, familial quality to the project. These are some of the exhibition brochures that we did there. Next project, I'll just mention it very briefly. Farsight, an interesting project. I was curator of the exhibition component there in 2005. And Farsight originally began in the 90s, 97 I believe is its first edition. It happens every number of years, but this is the last edition, actually 2005 is the last edition that happened. Farsight was a series of urban interventions happening in one of the largest conurbations in the world, which is the San Diego-Tijuana area, between at the border of Mexico City, at the border of Mexico and the United States. So it's one of the few sort of conurbations where the sort of first world meets the former third world. And I was responsible for putting together this exhibition, Farsight's Urban Crisis and Domestic Symptoms in Contemporary Art, which happened in two museums simultaneously, at the San Diego Museum of Art, which you would then cross on to Mexico City to see the other part of the exhibition, or vice versa, doing the opposite route, at the Centro Cultural Tijuana. The cover then you see an image of Brasilia. This was very much related to the idea of the informal, how the informal would come about in the urban plan. And here you see the paths somehow made by the pedestrian in opposition to the paths made by the actual city, you know. And on the back cover, you have a painting of a floor plan, one of the floor plan paintings of Guillermo Cuitca, an Argentine artist on the cover. This is a photograph by Sean Snyder, a series of 15 photographs made in Brasilia. The next project, I'll just mention it very briefly, Fragmentos and Souvenirs Paulistanos, Volume 1 at the Gallery in São Paulo, Galeria Luiz Estrela, made in 2005, brought together artists that somehow dealt with São Paulo, the imagery of São Paulo, or the history of São Paulo, juxtaposing it with souvenirs about São Paulo. So I invited maybe 10 or 12 different curators and critics to contribute with the memory they had of São Paulo. The idea of Volume 1, again, relates to this idea of the incompleteness, because there was only a Volume 1, there was never really a Volume 2. So there's this idea that somehow all the fragments and souvenirs could never really be sort of edited in a single book, and could be continued perhaps in the future at some point. So it leaves this open door for somehow putting together a complete series of all the fragments and souvenirs, which of course is something unattainable in relationship to the city of São Paulo. This is in 2005. In 2006, I was co-curator of the 27th Bienal São Paulo, so that was my second involvement in the Bienal São Paulo, the São Paulo Biennial. I was working under Chief Curator Lisette Lanhado with a group of other colleagues, co-curators. I was again editor of publications, in fact co-editor of publications along with the Chief Curator Lisette Lanhado, working with other curators, Rosa Martinez, Johan Voltz, Cristina Freire, and José Roca. We also organized seminars and residencies there as well. It was the first time, in fact, that the São Paulo Biennial hosted residencies with artists all over the country, in Brazil, in São Paulo, in Acre, in Rio Branco, and Recife as well. The 3 volumes that you see here relate to actually a model that later we used, Jens Hoffman and I, in the Istanbul Biennial. You'll see it later on. The first volume is the exhibition guide, and it's a volume that was available at the opening with interviews we had about 100 artists in the exhibition with short interviews with each artist. The second volume was made afterwards, and it included installation shots of the exhibitions as well as essays by the curators and commission essays and projects as well by certain artists that were invited to develop graphic projects for publication. And the title of that publication is Como Viver Junto, How to Live Together, which is coming from one of Roland Barthes' seminars in the 70s at the Collège des Femmes. So that was the inspiration of the exhibition. The cover of the How to Live Together book is also the poster for the exhibition, which is a detail of a work by Georges Marc. And then finally, the third volume, Seminarios, the seminars. Throughout the year of 2006, we organized 5 different seminars every sort of 2 or 3 months, and then all the transcriptions and the contents, and in some cases edited versions of the seminars, of the presentations, were then published in Portuguese only in this third volume. I believe the English translation is still available online. This is a book, Inhotim, through Inhotim. It's the catalog of a fairly new museum that is in Minas Gerais, in Brazil, called Inhotim, an open-air museum. And I worked with them in the catalog in 2008. Therefore, the catalog is called Através through Inhotim, and Através through is in fact the title of the work by Cildo Meireles, who is a very important Brazilian artist, has a number of large-scale installations permanently installed in Inhotim, and it's the cover work that you see there introduced on the book. And this is, I was only working, I was not sort of curatorially involved in any way with the project. I was just the editor of the book and working closely with Rodrigo Moura, in fact, a curator that have worked with me in Belo Horizonte and Pampulha. The second, thinking about books, many books, 20 books we have here. The second Trienal Poligráfica de São Juan, I was artistic director of that exhibition in 2009. It's in São Juan, a project in São Juan in Puerto Rico, exhibition project coming from a history of a printmaking biennial, which was a model very sort of disseminated worldwide, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and then when we reached 2000, much like it happened in Curitiba, there was a necessity to rethink that model and to come up with something more dynamic than the sort of printmaking model. And but they did retain the notion of the polygraphic somehow in this new unfolding of the exhibition. So the second Triennale in 2009 is actually coming from a history of a printmaking biennial in San Juan, in Puerto Rico, since the 1970s. And I was invited to be artistic director of the second edition. And there were many different programs in the exhibition, but I would just simply mention that the core program of the Triennale San Juan was actually inviting 20 different artists to produce different artist books with limited edition. So these are the covers. This is Abraham Cruz Villegas, this is Cao Guimarães, this is Juan Araújo, this is Fernando Braz, this is Mateo Lopes, this is Jesus Gugu Negron, Gilda Mantilla, Rivani Neuschwander, Dominique Gonzalez Foster, Renata Lucas, Nicolas Hobio. So the core section of the exhibition was actually, of course, now understanding it beyond the idea of the exhibition, understanding it more as a project. The core section of the project was actually to commission these books, and the artists had about 1 year to put together and a certain budget to put together. I believe it was around $8,000 or $9,000 for each of the artists to produce these limited edition books. I was working with two other curators, Jens Hoffman. I was the artistic director, and the two other curators were Julieta Gonzalez and Jens Hoffman. And each one of us was sort of editors of each one of these, a number of 5, 6, 7 books, each of us, independently produced and designed with, of course, close collaboration of the artists. So that was in 2009. 2009, again, a very polemic exhibition that I organized in Sao Paulo at the Museum of Modern Art. It's a panorama da arte brasileira, Brazilian arts, contemporary art mostly, panorama, and this is the 32nd edition. It's an exhibition that started running in the 70s by, always organized by the Museum of Modern Art in Sao Paulo. It was later, around the 90s, it became a biennial exhibition, and what I proposed with the exhibition when I was the curator was to actually only invite foreigners to the exhibition with works that somehow related to Brazilian culture, Brazilian history, or Brazilian hip art. So what we have on the cover of the exhibition is a work by Dominique Gonzalez Forster, a French artist who actually is French-Brazilian, because we could consider her half Brazilian somehow, because she's also partially based in Rio de Janeiro. And what she did was intervention in the canopy of the Ibirapuera Park in Sao Paulo, which is a famous historical building of Oscar Niemeyer. And on the back cover of the book, there is we produced a work specially made for the exhibition by Claire Fontaine, the sort of Italian Irish couple who lives in Paris. This is part of their Foreigners Everywhere neon sculptures made in Old Tupi. Old Tupi is a Brazilian, indigenous Brazilian extinct language, and thus the title of the exhibition was Mamoyuguara Opa Mamo Pupe, which in Old Tupi, this language that no one really speaks any longer, we had to ask a professor from the university to come up with the translation. In Old Tupi means foreigners everywhere, which of course related to the sort of indigenous roots of Brazil, but also describing the exhibition itself, since the exhibition only had foreign artists. What I show here as well are the opening pages, so you have an idea of how the opening pages unfolded of this catalog, which is a work by Garrett Wynne Evans fireworks that were lit during the opening of the exhibition. And the text reads: aqui tudo parece que ainda é construção e já é ruína. Here everything looks like it's still under construction and it's already ruined, which is a famous sentence by Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist that visited Brazil in the 50s and 60s, and it's observation that he made of São Paulo. So these are the opening pages of the catalog, so you feel a little bit the play that exists there, with Garrett Wynne Evans appropriating this sentence by Claude Lévi-Strauss, a sentence that in fact was later appropriated as well by Caetano Veloso, a famous Brazilian pop singer. Well, this is another exhibition project that I organized in Mexico City called The Traveling Show at Jumex Collection in 2010. Jumex is a private foundation and collection. Jumex means Jugos de México, which is juices of Mexico, and they have been actively buying contemporary artists today. Not after Indochine, probably no longer, but probably within the maybe the second largest contemporary art collection of Latin America. And they every year, they used to, I'm not sure if there's something they're still doing, they changed a little bit the program there. Every year they would invite a curator to organize an exhibition of the collection. And what I organized was an exhibition on traveling themes of different sorts. There's an interesting play with what's on the cover and the back cover of the catalog. I'll read the caption. It's a work by Romulo Morsino, in fact, a Swedish Argentine artist that had participated, in fact, in the Panorama and was one of the resident artists there that we invited to do residencies in Brazil in the 2009 Panorama. And it's a detail, the cover shows a detail of Inca panorama produced in Paris in 1820 by Dufour and Leroy, located in Ottingen, Germany, based on the novel The Incas or the Destruction of the Empire of Peru, 1777, by Jean-François Marmontel, used in Las Casas is Not a Home, in 2010 by Romulo Morsino, photographed by Serge Hasenboller. So the idea is that this image on the cover somehow has traveled, across over many centuries, from the Inca panorama to the work itself of Romulo Morsino. And I saw the work and I was very interested in bringing the work to the traveling show. And what he did then, from Malmo, where he lives, is he printed the actual photograph as a postcard, and he sent the postcard through the post to the, you can see there, to the collection in Mexico City. So that again, the postcard itself literally traveled from Sweden to Mexico, and what we reproduce on the cover is the actual postcard with the Swedish stamps and all the address of the collection over here. The traveling show, Fundación Colección Jumex, and this is the address, where the collection and the foundation is located. And then what I have following this are a number of, as you open the book, you would find a number of pages that were appropriated from different traveling books or books related to travel or exhibitions related to travel that were reproduced on the opening pages of the traveling book. So what you're seeing here are the opening pages of this traveling book, which somehow prompted a journey through other books. Some books of mine, actually, this is the opening pages of Fricciones, the exhibition that I showed previously, a conceptual art exhibition at MoMA, the James Clifford famous round books, Ali Darat, Iranian literary professor, Belated Travelers is the book, Imperial Eyes, another important book. So these again are the opening pages of the traveling book, which then finally started as such and ended with something that for me has become already quite common. I often have to travel with my books, so I have my portable library. So this is the last image of many of these books were sort of my references when I was working on the exhibition, and of course working and traveling a lot today as a curator. I often have a suitcase just dedicated to the books as a portable traveling library somewhere. Along with the traveling show at Jumex in Mexico City, there was also a sort of more formal exercise that I organized called the White Cabinet, which was basically a show looking at the white monochrome in a very particular sort of white cube, pristine white cube that the collection has there in their building. And the publication was made in the format almost of a scale, in the scale of the floor plan, in the three-dimensional scale of the actual exhibition room. This is another book I edited in 2010. Art Nexus is perhaps one of the most important magazines in Latin American art. They were celebrating also 35 years, in fact, yeah. And I was invited to select essays and articles and reviews relating somehow to Brazilian art. And again, I've always tried to question the limitations of what the nationality is, what Brazilian is, particularly in the panorama that comes up. And here then we reproduce, it was quite challenging to convince them to reproduce artists that were not sort of non-Brazilians but have a close relationship to Brazilian culture, such as Daniel Ortega here and Carlos Garaycoa, next to artists such as Adriano Pedrosa, Regina Silveira, Iguani Neuschwander, Jacques Lerner, Rosângela Renaud, Melissa Soares, and another sort of non-Brazilian, the Argentine artist, Jorge Maki. This is the catalogue of an exhibition, a retrospective exhibition by artist Ernesto Neto that I organized in Mexico City and in Monterrey. It traveled, actually organized by Monterrey, the Marco Museu de Arte Contemporânea de Monterrey in 2011, and then in 2012 traveled to the Antigo Colégio São Ildefonso in Mexico City. And the Lingua de Ernesto is basically looking at the entire artist's work. And then we finally get to the legible poster here of the 12th Istanbul Biennial. This is the poster we organized, we put together for the press conference in 2011. Basically, what we did was collect 2 years of biennial announcements that had come up in efflux. So the sort of sheer volume of announcements of biennial-related and triennial-related events were somehow graphically expressed there. And here, in bold, over here we have our own, the announcement of our own appointments as curators of the exhibition. And this somehow informed our decision of not avoiding a sort of a title for the Istanbul Biennial, the 12th Istanbul Biennial, which in the end was called Untitled 12th Istanbul Biennial. And these are the publications that we put together. This is the exhibition floor plan. This is the exhibition guide. Once again, thinking about the model that I had developed in Sao Paulo in 2005. This is the short guide with interviews with the artists. This is Remembering Istanbul, the book that we put together after a conference that had been organized a year prior to the exhibition in 2010, in the fall of 2010. We invited, the conference was called Remembering Istanbul. We invited curators of all the past editions of the Istanbul Biennial to give short presentations and to remember somehow the exhibition, their respective biennial edition. That was in the fall of 2010, so in September 2011, when the exhibition opened, we released the book, which also included presentations of a number of Turkish artists who were also responding to the presentations of the curators, the previous biennial curators, but also giving their account in terms of their participation in the biennial, or even as privileged viewers, no privileged spectators over the many years of the different biennials. And then the third volume, the larger volume, included installation shots of the actual exhibition, as well as commission essays and our own conversation between Jens and myself, and introduction to the different sections of the exhibition. The exhibition, again rather briefly, took inspiration on the work of Cuban Puerto Rican artist Felix Gonzalez. I would say that the main concern of the exhibition was to look at the relationships between politics and aesthetics, and to try to look at art that is, of course, socially and politically engaged and invested in these issues, but with a strong aesthetic or formal concern as well. And Felix Gonzalez Torres, the inspiration for the exhibition, came up precisely as an example of an artist, a mestizo artist somehow, an artist who was Cuban Puerto Rican, but later lived in the US, so also an artist between sort of the North and South, from a very strong mestizo background and culture, which is Cuba. So looking at his works, which mostly works from the 90s and late 80s, his works as fine examples of works that really articulated the political, the social, the personal, and the aesthetic. No? The exhibition was divided into 5 different sections, and here what you have is the floor plan that you can barely see. I have better image later, and the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres that inspired the group show. The exhibition the biennial itself was composed of about 55 solo shows and 5 group shows. And the group shows, as we will see, these 5 different group shows, were all taking as inspiration, again, a specific work of Felix Gonzalez Torres. This is Untitled Abstraction. So you have the floor plan of the whole section of Untitled Abstraction here. Here you have the actual group show with about 30 artists here. And these are the solo presentations, as you can see here. And this is just a view through the Anthropophagia building that housed the section abstraction. This is the work by Felix Gonzalez Torres that inspired that entire section. We worked closely with Hiro Nishizawa, who is a Japanese architect. This is Untitled Bronze. Ross being Felix Gonzalez Torres' lover who had died of AIDS, so it was a section dealing a lot with queer issues and love. This is Untitled Passport. Again, here the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres that inspired the exhibition. And gives title to the whole section, Untitled Passport. And here a view where you see Zarina, the Indian artist, with the installation shot there, showing a bit of the architecture also of Nishizawa. And again, the floor plan. This is where the group show was, and these are the solo shows around them. This is Untitled History, the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres that inspires it once again. This is where the group show was held, and then the solo shows the individual rooms around it, and this is a vista of the back of Jonathan Andrade you see there, the work of a Brazilian artist. And finally, Untitled Death by Gun, again with the book by Felix Gonzalez Torres, the view of the exhibition. All the group exhibitions were painted in grey color in order to sort of distinguish them quite clearly from the solo shows. And here we have again the group shows surrounded by the different solo shows. Yeah, that's it. There's of course much more to speak about these projects, but hopefully there will be some questions that I can clarify and fill in some information on the different exhibitions and publications.
Can you tell us about the project you're doing now in Amman for us?
Yeah, the project I'm doing now in Amman, yes. I think we're set now finally in the title, Conversations in Amman, Darat al Funun, exhibition, residency and talks program. This is my third visit to Amman. I first came here actually in 2011 during the research trip for the Istanbul Biennial. The idea of the project came very much from the site itself, the foundation of the institution here itself, as it has such generous spaces not only for exhibition, we counted today I think 23 different rooms for exhibitions, but also the residency spaces. So immediately when I saw the residency spaces, I thought there's a potential to do a residency program there that somehow unfolds later into an exhibition. The idea for the residency artists, that of course artists from all over the world, comes a lot from the past research that I've been doing in the last 3 years through Middle East and North Africa and the Arab world, or the region, as we say it here. And for me, Istanbul was the possibility to see many possible connections and dialogues and conversations with the art that is produced there and the art that is produced here. So this is what Istanbul tried to do as well, tried to juxtapose these productions. After that, I've been able to do research trips in South and Southeast Asia, as well as West Africa, and continuing a little bit, as much as I can, going back to these places here in the region. So what I feel is quite urgent, and I don't think it has been done enough, is precisely, has been talked about very much over the years, but we don't see that reflected in projects, is precisely the South-South conversation. Often it seems to me that the conversation, the exchanges in the exhibition projects or editorial projects end up being South, North or Center margins. So there is a lot of what I call intra-regional research and travels and exchange, so a lot of artists and curators traveling within that specific region, be it Middle East, North Africa, be it Latin America, be it Southeast Asia or Asia sometimes. But I think that what we're really lacking, and I think this is what I wanted to somehow bring to the project, is precisely the conversation between artists, not regions of course, but artists working in Latin America, artists working here in the region, and artists working in Southeast Asia or India. So what we're putting together in terms of the residency program, from which the exhibition will unfold, is a series of residencies over the fall, in September and October, with artists from Egypt, Palestine, Lebanon, Turkey, South Africa, Angola, Peru, Brazil, the Philippines, Vietnam, and India. I believe I have all the countries mentioned now. Brazil, my own country, of course, and Brazil. And we're bringing these artists, 6 at a time, in September and in October, culminating in this exhibition, which will include also works from the collection, and we will, from the collection here of the foundation, and we will also bring in artists and intellectuals and writers from Amman, from Jordan, to participate. There is a sort of the residency, we're putting together a certain program of the residency. The artists should be here for about 4 weeks. There is sort of a week where we do what we call the core conversations, where each artist then will not only come and spend time here in Amman, but also will present their work to the group. So there is this possibility of shared experience and exchange. Often we see artists participating in large-scale exhibitions where they don't get to meet or learn about, the other artists or the other work so much. So with this, I think with a smaller group like this, and this is I think quite interesting for, in this context of Amman, is precisely to provide a more focused concentration and a more focused exchange on each of the individual artists. So I think this is not just an exhibition, not just a residency program, but really hoping to stimulate a more active conversation. That's why the title Conversations in Amman, between these artists and of course between the scene here in Amman. It's a rather small scene, so that's why it also allows for this type of focus, I think. Did I answer? Yes, please.
What is the fine line for a curator working in a global art market or world?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
What is the fine line where when a curator is working in a global art world to not miss the specific and the local in their research and in their curating? Because sometimes the practices are becoming so similar. And I have a story of someone who went once to India and he was completely overwhelmed, and he felt very safe only when he entered the Contemporary Art Museum of that country, because he felt that he arrived in a very familiar space. And that was a very interesting account, because contemporary art spaces are becoming fairly familiar. And so how can the local not be missed in this kind of global gaze when a curator is searching for the local?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I should say that I don't consider myself a global curator and I don't have global aspirations. I really believe in sort of the micro scale of research and conversations as well, and I think this project very much reflects that concern with the micro and the intimate and the familiar. And that's why we're bringing 6 artists at a time. Of course, artists from all different parts of the world. I also should say that my research itself has being focused more at the margins. So, of course, been researching Latin America and Brazil for all my life. For the past 20 years, at least actively. I started the research here in the region when I first visited Beirut in 2006. 2005 when I was working towards 2006 when I was working towards the São Paulo biennial. After that, with Istanbul, I was able to develop and deepen this research a little bit more, but still never with the expectation of understanding and covering the region completely. There's always, for me, this micro level that I'm going from artist to artist, from individual conversation to individual conversation at a certain time. So I never expect to understand the scene completely or to have a full view of the scene or a complete understanding of what that scene is. And in that sense, I would say that this micro research is also looking for, I think each artist's production and that somehow is informed by that locality. I'm not trying to sort of place artists all together in a single genre or single movement or single trend. I'm always looking for the singularities. Of course, I'm trying to also detect certain parallels or certain crossovers between maybe an artist working in Bombay or an artist working in Manila or another artist working in Recife. I'm interested in that, but I think this discussion between the global and the local, I think it's also very much up to the artist, him or herself, to produce something that's informed by the local, not necessarily the locale where they're coming from, but their own experience of that place or the places that they have been to. So actually the idea of the global, we try, even with such a small project like this, we try to bring voices from different places. But it's not that with this I'm trying to sort of give a global perspective, by all means. It's very much these personal micro voices that are brought together to the exhibition, and are also brought together in order for them to exchange and learn from each other. So it's I really believe in the micro scale and the personal scale. I often go to a city to meet a single artist, to have that conversation. I'm always, particularly in a project like this, but even in Istanbul, at least for the artists that were being brought in for solo shows, I was only inviting artists that I really knew personally and that I had a conversation, because today, of course, in these times of Skype conversations and meetings, it becomes very seductive to lose that personal, but I really believe in this type of conversation. But I don't think everyone, each curator works in a different way, and I don't think, and each curator should find their own voice and their own models. I mean, this is just my own cartography somehow. I'm not sure if I responded.
No,
Okay. Yes?
Hi, thank you for coming. I was just wondering if you had any advice for aspiring curators.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I would say learn foreign language and live in a hemisphere other than your own, and try to learn also research a different discipline other than curatorial studies or contemporary art. Yes?
In your conversation, for me, central were two notions. The one was this concept of Anthropophagia. I don't know if I can spell it correctly.
Yeah, Anthropophagia is good,
Yeah. And then several times you mentioned also appropriate something and transform something by appropriation.
Yeah.
And this reminds me actually also as a curatorial practice that is quite common today. Also this conversation or citation model could fit into it. Probably you can give a little bit more explanation about these two notions and how they, for you or not, could relate on each other.
So I didn't understand the model the common model, curatorial model that you're referring to.
Actually, there is a a chain of citation of work, as you showed very interestingly with this Inca panorama.
Oh, right, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's a kind of citation, could also be a kind of appropriation, of course.
Yeah.
And it seems to me quite interestingly linked also to your model of anthropophagia.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could talk about this a
Well, it's anthropophagia. You could understand. I mean, it's not my model. It's a very well-known Brazilian sort of modernist manifesto. The Manifesto Anthropophago is written by Oswald de Andrade in 1928. It could be considered post-colonial model avant la lettre, before the post-colonial actually was invented. There is this notion of the mestizo, no, the mestizaje, which is the melting pot somehow, which is very important for not only for Brazilian culture but Latin American culture in general. Many of the 20th century sort of cultural thinkers that were trying to think about the Latin American somehow went back to mestizaje. The mestizaje again is bringing in the indigenous and the African and the European matrices together, be them Spanish or Portuguese. I'm often looking at models and looking at languages, somehow trying to think of outside the sort of well-known modern European parameters. And in order to do that, I can't detach myself completely from that, because of course we're speaking either, European languages and writing in these languages. And I don't think it's a question of abandoning these languages and these models altogether, but finding hybrid mestizo, and that's where the anthropophagia comes in as well, where you can appropriate a certain model and appropriate a certain language and digest it in a very sort of singular, hybrid, somehow bastard way perhaps, and then apply it to different objects of study, be them contemporary art or artifacts as well. So there's different possible models. It's a very difficult question when you pose that question. What are the, sometimes discussion comes about. As curators and critics working at the margins, we are also prompted to come up with our own toolbox, theoretical toolbox or art historical toolbox. Because it seems that if we're always using the European or Euro-American toolbox, it seems that the productions that are made at the margins are either somehow considered derivative of the sort of European, Euro-American canon, or else local versions, hybrid indigenous versions of minimalism or cubism or modernism or conceptualism. So it's a big question. I don't know if I'm responding to that somehow, to your question.
It's taking some ideas.
Yeah, I'm just giving different insights on the question, which is very...
It was probably two questions in one, sorry
Yeah,
for that.
but it's really a difficult question to come up.
But actually,
because the notion,
actually you did, because you said appropriative practice can also kind of be thought in within a mestissage practice.
Yeah. Yeah, going back to the global-local question and understanding of contemporary art, our understanding of art and contemporary art is already deeply European. So perhaps step outside of that. There is an interesting model that I've used a lot. Walter Mignolo is an Argentine contemporary academic. He works with this notion of de-Westernization, which is a really interesting model. And the de-Westernization, of course, is stepping back from the Euro-American canon and looking at what is outside the Western canon and the Western code, as he calls it, and perhaps looking into more closely at the African matrix. In my case, as a Brazilian, as a Latin American, looking more closely and in a deeper way to the African matrices and to the indigenous, and many indigenous matrices you find that, for example, that has been done by some, you see that coming up in 19th century, early 20th century art, in indigenismo, for example, you see that coming up in Peruvian art, in Mexican art, in the art of Ecuador and Brazil. There are some artists working with these indigenous references, but they are a bit nostalgic and still very much filtered through the Euro-American sort of canon of representation, so they become almost someone. I was showing this research that I've been doing in artists working with indigenism in the sort of early 20th century, and someone pointed out that's actually quite close to Orientalism somehow, but within your own culture. But there are artists today, younger artists today. I can think of Mariana Castillo de Bau, for example, a Mexican artist living in Berlin. I can think of Sandra Gamarra, for example, a Peruvian artist living in Madrid, who are working with these references, looking at different matrices. But I think my concern with, to put it under a single heading, the South-South conversation, is very much informed by that. Because there are certain experiences that are, very common, and I find that I remember traveling in Manila, and a curator was describing a situation of his own museum in a very, singular way, and say, oh, this is very different from Europe because of this and this and that, and we have this lack of support and no government funding, and all those characteristics that he was describing of being very particular to a curator working in a museum in Manila were actually very common to a curator working maybe in Peru or in Brazil in a similar institution. So, but the point of reference for this curator was always Europe and was always North America, the rich sort of developed institutions and infrastructure in general. So when you suddenly stop looking only at that type of model and you maybe look to the side, you may find certain commonalities. There's a big challenge there. Also, and I think this is, what's interesting about the project here is because I think artists and curators often end up going or are drawn to projects and residencies in Europe and in North America, or within the region more so than the other regions. So this is what I think is really interesting here, is to be able to bring these artists, a very small number of them. But hopefully this will have a ripple effect in their lives, and it will allow them to see their practices and other practices in a different way. Did I answer? Any other questions, perhaps?
The challenges for artists, I'm very relating, but the challenges for artists are always also when you're working and wanting to subvert the dominant narrative, is when you exclude yourself and put yourself outside of it, then you become marginalized, and then you find yourself having to always refer and situate your work in relation to the dominant narrative and the dominant practice. So that there's always that paradox. You are caught if you ignore it completely. But if you really want to situate yourself completely outside of it, also you can become off the radars, somehow. But that's where the interesting space is.
But I guess you have to be true to your interest and to your research, even if it's not somehow trendy or if it's not,
Absolutely. But,
this is really. I hope artists, really are still invested in that and in finding these singular ways. I was just in India, actually overwhelmed with the research there, and it's interesting to see, for example, contemporary artists working with references to miniature painting. It's something completely outside of the Western canon. So, and in this process of somehow de-Westernization that Mignolo speaks about, which for me was quite interesting, I think there are many lessons to learn from these works. They're more difficult. I've seen artists, for example, there's an artist from Sudan, El Salahi, fantastic painter, who's now Tate is doing retrospective of his. And he's, of course, working with the motifs of African masks. I was at the Tate the other day, and I was overhearing a tour, and the guide was saying, oh, because his references are Picasso and Picasso's use of African masks.
Well, that's
So it's like it gets filtered through the outside, European modernist canon. But it's each individual has their own, set of lenses and models and languages to look at these subjects. But the idea, I think, is to multiply. I mean, at least I'm in favor of that, to multiply these possibilities, these possible models and languages and filters.
There's a book by Thomas McVie called Art and Otherness, and he talks about this.
Thomas McEvery,
and Machiavelli, so
Yeah.
Machiavelli. It's about when African art was almost considered craft or almost primitive art.
Yeah, that's another challenge.
And then coming through the prism or the gaze filter through the gaze of Picasso and modernist painting, then it becomes art.
Yeah, there's a fantastic, Thomas McEvery actually just passed away last week, and there's a fantastic essay in that book, which I just recently reread, which is a critique of an exhibition held at MoMA in the 80s called Primitivism, which it actually tried to bring. I've been looking at that model as a very sort of counter model that I want to avoid, but bringing in modern African art.
Yeah. Not through the prism of the Occident, but immediately by going to it.
I hope we can continue this conversation in November.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Thank you
so
very
much
much
for coming.